She asked me like she was afraid I might say no. That was the part that stayed with me long after everything else had come and gone. The way she stood at the edge of that bench outside the feed store, one hand resting on the wooden post beside her. Her voice so quiet I almost missed it beneath the wind coming off the plains. "May I sit with you?" she said. And I looked up from my coffee tin and my busted saddle strap, and I said yes, because there wasn't a decent man alive who would have said anything else. But I reckon if I'd known what that one word would cost me, what it would give me, and what it would take, I might have thought harder before I opened my mouth. Or maybe not. Maybe I'd say yes 1,000 times over and never once regret a single one. Her name was Clara Hayes. I didn't know that yet, sitting there in the dust of Millhaven on a Tuesday morning in October of 1883. All I knew was that she was the kind of woman you noticed the moment she came into view, not in the way that loud things get noticed, but in the way a candle flame catches your eye in a dark room. You don't mean to look, you just do. She was tall, with dark auburn hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed bonnet, and her dress was the color of late summer wheat, plain and practical, the kind worn by women who worked hard and didn't have time for foolishness. Her eyes were a clear, deep hazel, the kind that caught light at odd angles and made you wonder what she was thinking. She was striking in a quiet, unhurried way, and she carried herself with the kind of dignity that didn't come from pride, but from something deeper, something earned. She sat down beside me, and I noticed then the way she moved, careful and deliberate, her right leg taking her weight in a way that told the story before she said a word. Her left leg ended just below the knee, the wooden prosthetic beneath her skirt doing its work without complaint, the way she did everything I would come to learn. She settled onto the bench and folded her hands in her lap and looked out at the street, where a boy was chasing a hog past the barber and 2 old men were arguing about something near the livery. She breathed in slow and easy, like she'd earned the right to sit still for a moment, and I went back to my saddle strap and didn't say anything, because it seemed like that was what she needed. We sat like that for a good 5 minutes, just 2 strangers sharing a bench in a town neither of us called home. If you're the kind that enjoys stories like this one, stories from the frontier, where ordinary people lived extraordinary moments, go ahead and subscribe to this channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. We'll leave a little heart for every one of you. Now, let's get back to Clara. She spoke first. "You're not from Millhaven," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am," I said, passing through. Heading west toward the Callaway spread. Got work lined up there come spring. She nodded, like that answered something she'd been wondering. "I'm from the Hayes farm," she said, "about 6 miles north of town. My husband sent me in for flour and seed." I said I reckoned that was a long ride for flour and seed. She smiled then, just a little, at the corner of her mouth. "Everything's a long ride out here," she said. "You get used to it." I told her my name, Eli Merritt, late of Dodge City, before that New Mexico territory, before that a handful of places I barely remembered. She told me hers, and we shook hands the way people did in those days when they wanted to be civil without being familiar. And then we went back to looking at the street. I should have ridden out that morning. My horse was watered, and my saddlebag was full, and there wasn't a single good reason to be sitting on that bench outside the feed store, talking to a married woman I'd never met. But something about Clara Hayes made me slow my thoughts down. She had a stillness about her that was rare out on the frontier, where most folks moved through their days like they were trying to outrun something. She just sat there like the world could wait, and somehow that made me want to sit there too. "Does it pain you?" I asked, and I regretted it the moment I said it, because it was none of my business and I knew it. But she didn't flinch. She looked down at her leg and then back up at the street, and she said, "Not much anymore. It did, for a long time. But you learn where the hurt is, and you work around it." I thought about that for a while. "You've been managing it long?" "Since I was 24, she said. "Farm accident. That was 3 years ago now." She paused. "My husband, Thomas, he stayed. A lot of men wouldn't have." The way she said it told me everything. Not that she doubted Thomas Hayes was a good man, just that she'd learned somewhere along the way that goodness had a cost, and she was still figuring out how to carry the weight of being someone's obligation. I didn't say anything to that. What was there to say? She bought her flour and her seed. I fixed my saddle strap. And when she came back out of the store, struggling a little with the weight of the sack, I took it from her without asking and carried it to her wagon without making a thing of it. And she let me, which told me she was practical before she was proud. She thanked me with a straight look and a nod and climbed up to the bench with the ease of someone who had made peace with the particular geometry of her own body. And then she looked at me with those hazel eyes and said, "You ride north. You'll pass the Hayes farm. The road forks at the cottonwood tree. Left goes to the Callaway spread." I said I'd keep that in mind. She clicked her tongue at the horse and drove away, and I stood in the dust of the street and watched her go. And I told myself that was the end of it. A conversation on a bench. A moment in the middle of a Tuesday. The kind of thing you forget by nightfall. I did not forget it by nightfall. The cottonwood tree was exactly where she said it would be, and the fork in the road was plain enough. Left for Callaway, right for Hayes. I sat on my horse for a long time at that fork. It was getting late, the sun dropping fast behind the ridge to the west, and the wind had picked up cold and sharp, the way it did in that part of the plains, when October decided it was done pretending to be September. I had my bedroll and enough jerky to last me 2 more days, and the Callaway spread was still a good 4 hours north. I could make camp, or I could ride on in the dark, or I could. I turned right. I told myself it was the cold. I told myself I'd ask about a place to sleep in the barn and be gone before sunrise. I told myself a dozen things, and none of them were entirely untrue, and none of them were entirely honest either. And by the time the Hayes farmhouse came into view across the flat, dark land, lamplight glowing orange in the windows against the coming night, I'd stopped trying to explain myself to myself and just rode. Thomas Hayes answered the door. He was a broad-shouldered man, maybe 40, with thick hands and a sun-darkened face, and the kind of eyes that looked at everything straight on, measuring it. He looked at me, and then at my horse, and then back at me. "Help you?" he said. I told him my name. I told him I'd met his wife in town that morning. I told him I was heading for the Callaway spread, and the weather was turning, and I was wondering if I could pay for a night in his barn. He looked at me for a moment that stretched out longer than it should have. Then he opened the door wider. "Clara," he called. "There's a man here says he talked to you in Millhaven. Eli Merritt." Clara came through from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a cloth, and she looked at me in the doorway, and something moved in her face that I couldn't quite name. Not surprise, not exactly, more like recognition. The kind that comes when something you half expected finally arrives. "The barn's fine," she said to Thomas, then to me. "Come in and eat first. It's too cold to ride on tonight." Thomas Hayes looked at his wife for a moment, and then he stepped back and let me in. And that was how it started. Not with anything dramatic, not with a look or a word or a moment you could point to and say, that was it. That was where everything changed. Just a door opening and a woman wiping flour from her hands and a cold wind at my back. The kitchen smelled like cornbread and wood smoke and something else. Pine resin, maybe, from the fresh split logs stacked beside the hearth. It was a spare room, clean and plain, the way frontier kitchens were, with a pine table and 4 chairs and a cast-iron stove that threw enough heat to make the place feel warmer than the rest of the house. Thomas sat at the head of the table, and I sat across from Clara, and we ate beans and cornbread and salt pork, and nobody said much of anything, which suited me fine. Thomas Hayes was not an unfriendly man. He was the kind of quiet that comes from having thought most things through already. The kind of man who didn't waste words, but didn't waste goodwill either. He asked me about the Callaway spread, and I told him what I knew. He told me the road north flooded bad this time of year after rain, and there'd been rain 2 days back, and I'd likely find the low crossing impassable until morning. He said it matter-of-factly, like information he thought I ought to have, and I thanked him for it, and Clara topped off my coffee without being asked. It was a quiet, ordinary evening in a quiet, ordinary farmhouse. There was nothing about it that should have lodged itself so deep inside me that I'd still be thinking about it 40 years later.
But there are evenings like that in a man's life.
Evenings that feel ordinary while they're happening and turn out to be anything but. And that was one of them. After supper, Thomas went out to check on the animals, and I offered to help Clara with the dishes. She said she didn't need help. I sat back down. She washed up with the efficiency of someone who had done that particular task about 10,000 times, and the lamplight moved across the angles of her face, and I looked at the table instead. "You didn't have to stop," she said after a while. "Road was flooded," I said. She glanced at me over her shoulder. "Thomas mentioned the road after you showed up, not before." I didn't have a good answer for that. She dried her hands and turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at me with a directness that made something tighten in my chest. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself," she said quietly. "I'm just saying, you can be honest about things here. Thomas is a good man. I'm a good woman. There's nothing complicated about this." I said I reckoned she was right. She said, "Good night, Mr. Merritt," and took her lamp and went down the hall. And I sat alone in the kitchen for a while, listening to the wind work itself up outside. And I thought about what she'd said, that there was nothing complicated about this. And I knew she believed it. And I knew she was wrong. And I knew that telling her so would have been the worst thing I could have done. The barn was warm enough. I had my bedroll and my saddle for a pillow, and the horses moved softly in their stalls, and the wind outside sounded like it was trying to get in, but couldn't quite manage it. I lay there and stared at the dark above me, and tried to sleep, and didn't. Around midnight, I heard the barn door open. I sat up slow. My hand went to my holster before I could think about it. Frontier instinct older than any thought. But it was Clara, in a long coat over her nightdress, her hair down around her shoulders, carrying a lamp and a blanket. She moved carefully across the barn floor, the way she always moved. Deliberate, unhurried, like she'd made peace with every inch of ground before she put her weight on it. "I brought you another blanket," she said. "The temperature's dropping." I took the blanket. "Much obliged," I said. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, the lamp throwing a small circle of light between us, the rest of the barn full of shadow and the breathing of horses. The wind pressed against the walls. In the distance, something, a coyote maybe, called once and went quiet. "Does your husband know you're out here?" I asked. "He sleeps heavy," she said. Not an answer. Not quite a lie either. I looked at her standing there in the lamplight, with her hair down and the cold pressing in all around us, and I thought about what she'd said in the kitchen. I'm a good woman. And I believed it. I believed it absolutely. Which was exactly why I said what I said next. Mrs. Hayes, I said, you ought to go back inside. Something moved in her face. Gratitude, maybe, or something more complicated than that. I know, she said. She stood there one moment longer. Then she turned and walked back across the barn the way she'd come, the lamp swinging a little in her hand, and I watched the light diminish as the door opened and closed. And then it was just the dark and the wind and the horses. I didn't sleep much, but I slept better than I'd expected. In the morning, Thomas Hayes made coffee and sliced salt pork and cooked it on the stove while Clara slept in, which he told me she did most mornings on account of her leg paining her more in cold weather. He said it matter-of-factly, not looking for sympathy, not offering explanation. Just the facts of his life laid out plain. We drank our coffee in the kitchen while the sun came up, thin and pale through the window, and lit up the dust on the floorboards.
Thomas talked about the farm, the south field that hadn't yielded much this year, the fence line that needed replacing, the well that had gone brackish in August and come back sweet in September. He talked about it the way a man talks about something he loves and worries about in equal measure. And I listened and nodded and thought about Clara in the lamplight and hated myself a little for it.
She's stronger than she looks, Thomas said out of nowhere. I looked up. He was looking at his coffee cup. Clara, he said, she's the strongest person I know. I want you to understand that, in case you were feeling sorry for her. He glanced at me then, steady and clear. She doesn't need it. I don't, I said. Feel sorry for her, I mean. He nodded, slow, like I'd confirmed something he'd already known. Good, he said. And that was all. I've thought about that conversation many times since. About what Thomas Hayes knew and didn't know, what he chose to say, and what he chose to let go unsaid. He was a good man. I believed that then, and I believe it still. He understood something about the nature of things that a lot of men never figured out. That you can't hold on to a person by clenching your fist. That the only way to keep what matters is to trust it enough to let it be. Clara came out while I was saddling my horse. She was dressed for the day, her hair back up, her face composed and calm. She stood in the doorway of the barn while I tightened the cinch and checked the stirrups, and she said, "Safe travels, Mr. Merritt." I said, "Yes, man. Thank you for the hospitality." She said, "Come back through if you ever need the fork in the road again." I looked at her then. She was looking at me steady and direct, the way she always looked at everything. And I couldn't tell for certain what she meant by it. Whether it was just frontier courtesy or something else. Something she was allowing herself just this once. I reckon I'll never know for certain.
But I looked at her in the morning light. This woman with her auburn hair and her hazel eyes and her quiet dignity, and the life she'd built with her own 2 hands and her wooden leg and her good husband. And I thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the bravest thing I ever did was turn my horse north and ride away. The plains opened up around me, wide and gray and endless. The wind had settled. The road north was clear. I worked the Callaway spread from November through to April. It was hard work and honest work, and I slept well most nights, which is more than a man has a right to expect. I thought about the Hayes farm more than I should have. Not obsessively, not in a way that aided me, but the way you think about a piece of music you heard once in a saloon and never quite forgot. Something with a melody you couldn't name, but couldn't lose either. Spring came the way it always did on the plains, sudden and wet and full of mud. I got my pay from old man Callaway and loaded up my saddlebags and stood at the gate of the spread looking south. And I thought about that fork in the Cottonwood Road.
and I made a decision that I told myself was practical, and probably wasn't. I rode south. Not to the Hayes farm. I wasn't a fool, and I wasn't a scoundrel. I rode through Millhaven, intending only to resupply and move on east, maybe toward Kansas, maybe further. I told myself that, and almost believed it, until I turned the corner by the feed store and saw Clara Hayes sitting on that same bench in the same spot, her hands folded in her lap and her face turned toward the street. She looked up when I rode past. Our eyes met. She didn't smile exactly, but something changed in her face. A settling, like something that had been slightly out of alignment, found its proper place. I tied my horse and walked over and said, "Anyone sitting here?" She said, "No." I sat down. We sat there a while, the two of us, watching Millhaven go about its Tuesday morning business, and neither of us said anything for a good long time, and it was the most comfortable silence I had known in years. "You came back through," she said finally. "I did," I said. "Thomas is well," she said. "The South Field came in better this year." "I'm glad," I said. "He talks about you sometimes," she said. "Says you were good company." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. Clara looked at her hands in her lap. "I want to tell you something," she said quietly. "And I want you to let me say it, and not make anything more of it than it is." She paused. "That night you stopped at the farm, when I brought the blanket out to the barn." "I remember," I said. "I stood outside the door for about 10 minutes before I went in," she said. "I was trying to talk myself out of it. Not because I was going to do anything wrong, just because—" She stopped, chose her words careful the way she did everything. "Because I wanted to be near something real. Something that had nothing to do with obligation or debt or pity. And I thought you might be that. And I thought that was selfish of me." "It wasn't selfish," I said. "Maybe not," she said. "But it wasn't entirely fair to you either." I looked at her then, this woman sitting straight and honest in the pale spring light, telling me a hard, true thing because she thought I deserved to hear it, and she needed to say it. And I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not desire, though maybe there was some of that too, the way there always is when something this honest happens between two people. But something deeper and quieter. Respect, I reckon. The kind that makes you want to be better than you are. "Clara," I said, "I sat on this bench for 6 months. In my head, I mean. I've been riding that road back to Millhaven since November." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "And I'm going to ride on east," I said. "Today. And I'm not going to come back." She looked at me. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you were honest with me," I said. Seemed fair to be honest back. She nodded, slow. "All right," she said. We sat there a while longer. The boy from the barber's came out and swept the step. A wagon came in from the North Road, full of seed. Somewhere up the street, 2 dogs were having a conversation that neither of them intended to finish. "I'll tell Thomas you said hello," she said at last. "Tell him the South Field deserved a good year," I said. She almost smiled. Almost. "Safe travels, Mr. Merritt." "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Hayes." I stood up and untied my horse, and rode east down the main street of Millhaven, and I did not look back. Not because I was afraid of what I'd see, but because I'd already seen it. A woman on a bench in the morning light, hands folded in her lap, looking at the street with those steady hazel eyes.
A woman who had lost something and built a life anyway, who carried her weight without complaint and looked at the world without flinching, who had offered me one true moment in a barn on a cold October night, and then gone back inside because she was a good woman and she knew it and lived it. I rode east for about 2 miles before I stopped and sat on my horse in the middle of the empty road and let the feeling settle. The plains stretched out around me in every direction, flat and pale green and endless. The sky so big, it made a man feel like a period at the end of a long sentence. The wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves. I reckon I sat there for a good 10 minutes. Then I rode on. There's a thing that happens sometimes in a life. Not often, maybe 3 or 4 times if you're lucky, where you cross paths with someone who shows you something about yourself you didn't know was there. Not because they said anything wise or did anything remarkable, just because they were honest in a way that called out the honesty in you, and for a little while, you were both more real than usual, more present, more alive to the actual weight and texture of things. Clara Hayes was that for me, and I was, I think, something like that for her, though I'll never know for certain, and I wouldn't ask if I could. The frontier was full of stories like that. Men and women thrown together by chance and weather and the particular loneliness of the open country, finding in each other something they needed and couldn't name, and then going their separate ways because that was the right thing, and the right thing was hard and worth doing. Most of those stories never got told. They happened in kitchens and barns and on benches outside feed stores, quiet and ordinary and complete, and then they became part of the person, something they carried without explaining. I carried Clara Hayes for a long time, not in a way that weighed on me or got in the way of living, just there, like a sound you heard once that stayed in the body the way sounds do, in the chest, somewhere behind the ribs, warm and particular, and impossible to entirely let go. I heard, maybe 8 years later, that Thomas Hayes had died. Fever, I was told. That Clara had kept the farm running, her and a farmhand she'd taken on, and eventually a son who'd come to her in some way I never got the particulars of. I heard she was well, that the South Field kept coming in good. I was glad. I was genuinely glad. That's the thing about the kind of feeling she left me with. It didn't want for her to be unhappy. It didn't need her to need me. It just wanted her to be okay in the world. And she was. And that was enough. I'm an old man now. I've ridden a lot of roads since Millhaven, and most of them I barely remember. But I remember that bench outside the feed store. I remember a woman's voice, quiet against the wind. "May I sit with you?" And I remember saying yes. And I remember everything that came after. All of it. Every quiet, careful hour of it. And I would not trade a single moment. Not the ache of it, not the weight of riding away, not the 10 minutes sitting alone on a horse in the middle of an empty road trying to figure out what I felt. I would not trade any of it. Because that's what the frontier does to you, if you let it. It strips away everything unnecessary and leaves you standing in front of what's real. And if you're honest, if you're brave enough to be honest, the way Clara Hayes was brave, then sometimes the most ordinary thing in the world turns into the truest thing you've ever known. A bench in a dusty town, a cold October wind, a woman's voice. "May I sit with you?" I said yes. And that was everything. Before we close out today, if this story reached something in you, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know what city you're watching from. We go through every single one and leave a little heart for each of you. Your support means the world out here on the frontier. Until next time, ride safe, and keep looking for the true things.